My name is Gemma Bennett, and I am 26 years old. Last July, the thermometer on our kitchen wall read 115 degrees outside. My mother stood between me and the hallway, arms crossed over her linen blouse, breathing in a shallow, practiced way. "Your sister gets sick every time she sees your face," she said. "Pack your things. Tonight." I set my glass of ice water on the granite island. Down the hall behind a closed door, my sister Madison was supposedly hyperventilating into a paper bag. A missed boutique appointment, a denied vacation request, or my simple refusal to co-sign a luxury apartment lease for her unemployed fiancé were all it took to trigger a sudden panic attack. Tonight, my mother had decided my mere presence in the house was a medical threat. "I cannot have her health deteriorating, Gemma," she told me. "You agitate her. You walk around here counting pennies and making her feel guilty for trying to heal. We need space. She needs space." I did not argue. I did not remind her who paid the electricity bill, keeping that kitchen a perfect 72 degrees while the Phoenix desert baked outside. Welcome back to Orange Vengeance. This is a place where we share real stories about quiet boundaries, standing your ground, and people getting exactly what they earned. Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. I work as a financial manager downtown. My job is to find the leaks in a budget and seal them shut. For 3 years, I had treated my family like a failing client I refused to drop. I paid the premium air conditioning bill. I covered the insurance. I bought the groceries that stocked the refrigerator my mother was currently leaning against. But pointing out a ledger to a woman who deals in guilt is a waste of breath. So I walked past her to my bedroom. I pulled a hardshell suitcase from the closet. I folded 3 tailored suits, a handful of blouses, my running shoes, and my toiletries. I took my work laptop and the leather folio containing my private records. Nothing else. When I rolled my suitcase down the hall, my father Richard was waiting in the foyer. He stood near the console table with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, studying the baseboards. He had spent his entire marriage taking the path of least resistance. Tonight, that path involved watching his eldest daughter get cast out into a lethal Arizona summer night so his youngest could monopolize the oxygen. He did not meet my eyes. He just shifted his weight, silently endorsing the eviction. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Leave the keys," my mother called out from the kitchen. She was unwilling to witness the exit she had orchestrated. I unclipped the heavy brass house key from my ring. I held it for a fraction of a second before dropping it onto the console. The metal struck the wood with a sharp clatter. My father flinched. "Goodbye, Dad," I said. I opened the door and the heat hit me like a physical blow. The air was thick and suffocating, the kind of heat that makes it hard to pull oxygen into your lungs. Throwing a family member out into the desert summer is something people around here consider unforgivable. My parents did it without blinking. The drive downtown took 20 minutes. The tires of my sedan hummed over the asphalt of Interstate 10, the city lights stretching across the valley floor. I did not cry. Tears are an inefficient response to bad data. Instead, I rerouted my logistics. I pulled into the valet circle of a high-rise corporate hotel in the financial district. The concierge processed my card without asking questions. My room overlooked the city skyline. I set my suitcase near the closet, walked to the glass desk by the window, and sat down in the ergonomic chair. I did not turn on the television. I did not unpack my clothes. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I logged into my encrypted banking portal. My parents thought they had merely kicked a toxic element out of their house. They did not realize they had just evicted their safety net. I watched the loading icon spin, preparing to pull the first digital lever. The glow of the laptop screen cast a pale blue light across the hotel desk. Outside the window, the Phoenix skyline spread out like a grid of glowing embers, radiating the trapped heat of the day. Inside my room, the ambient temperature held steady at a crisp 68 degrees. I stared at the banking portal login page for a long moment. In my profession, numbers tell the stories that people try to hide. I manage corporate risk for tech firms. I spend my days building financial models, forecasting deficits, and finding the quiet, subtle leaks that drain a company dry. Numbers do not lie. They do not throw panic attacks, and they do not demand space to heal. For 3 years, I had treated my own family like a volatile client portfolio. I stepped in when my parents began drowning under the weight of their own choices. I assumed the role of the silent safety net, because that is what reliable daughters are conditioned to do. I paid the monthly premium for the air conditioning that kept their house a sanctuary against the brutal Arizona summer. I covered the auto insurance, the property taxes, and the ever-widening deficit on their mortgage. Every dollar I earned in the competitive corporate ecosystem downtown flowed backward into that house, patching holes I had not created. I did it seamlessly. I did it without ever receiving a shred of gratitude, because my contributions were expected while my sister's mere existence was celebrated. Madison had spent her entire adult life curating a vague, undiagnosed anxiety. It was an incredibly effective tool. Whenever the conversation turned to her lack of employment or her unfinished degree, a sudden shortness of breath would emerge. If my parents asked her to contribute to the household chores, a migraine would miraculously appear. Her fragility became the central axis around which our family rotated. She weaponized her distress to monopolize the resources of the house. She demanded total quiet before noon. She demanded organic, specialized groceries that I paid for. Most importantly, she demanded money for her endless pursuit of wellness. My mother, Diane, enabled every piece of it. To Diane, Madison was a delicate flower requiring constant cultivation, while I was the dirt she grew in. I was expected to provide the nutrients and remain invisible. My 60-hour work weeks were dismissed as me being a workaholic, a trait my mother found distasteful compared to Madison's dedication to self-care. I sat in boardrooms negotiating high-level contracts only to come home and be reprimanded for closing the front door too loudly while my sister was resting. I typed my password into the portal and hit enter. The dashboard loaded, displaying the architecture of my financial life. I clicked into the joint checking account. I had opened this account with my mother 2 years ago to streamline the transfer of funds for household expenses. It was supposed to be a conduit for the electric bill, and the groceries a way to ensure the lights stayed on without me having to write physical checks every week. I monitored it loosely, trusting the rhythm of our monthly expenses. That trust was a miscalculation. I pulled the ledger for the past 30 days. The screen populated with a long list of transactions. I scrolled past the familiar charges: the utility payment to the local power grid, the water bill, the property insurance premium. Then my eyes caught a deviation. It was a charge for $800 processed 3 days ago. The vendor name read Desert Bloom Holistic Center. I leaned closer to the screen. My fingers moved over the trackpad, sorting the transactions by dollar amount. A new pattern emerged, stark and undeniable. 4 days ago, a withdrawal of $1,200. The memo line simply read, cash. 2 days before that, a transfer of $1,500 to an external account I did not recognize. I ran a quick background check on the routing number using a financial tool on my work server. The account belonged to Madison. My pulse remained steady, but a cold clarity washed over me. I cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals with the events at home. The tension in the house had escalated sharply over the last week. My mother had been picking fights over nothing, elevating minor inconveniences into major offenses. She had complained that my work shoes left scuff marks on the tile. She had claimed the smell of my coffee brewing in the morning was triggering Madison's nausea. The eviction tonight was not a sudden emotional reaction to my sister having a panic attack. It was not about Madison getting sick every time she saw my face. It was a calculated, premeditated maneuver. My mother had been testing the boundaries of the joint account, extracting large sums of cash and moving money directly to Madison. She knew that I audited my own accounts at the end of every month. She knew that in 3 days I would download the statements, review the line items, and confront her about the missing thousands. I would demand receipts. I would cut off the funding. They did not kick me out to protect Madison's mental health. They kicked me out to remove the auditor. By casting me into the Phoenix heat, Diane believed she was buying time. She thought that if I was scrambling to find an apartment dealing with the emotional fallout of being rejected by my family and distracted by the logistics of relocation, I would ignore the bank statements. She assumed my grief would override my competence. She expected me to fold to eventually call her crying, begging to come back, willing to overlook the financial discrepancies just to be allowed back into the fold. I looked at the total amount drained over the last 7 days. Almost $4,000. Money I had earned analyzing data sets and building risk models. Money that was supposed to keep the roof over their heads. They had cannibalized their own safety net to fund a scam, and they thought I was too weak to strike back. The sheer audacity of the betrayal burned away any lingering guilt I might have felt about leaving the key on the console. I am a financial manager. I understand that when a toxic asset begins draining the portfolio, you do not try to heal it, you excise it. I navigated to the account settings. The interface offered a series of administrative options. I bypassed the alerts and the transfer limits. I located the section for authorized users. Diane's name sat there in bold letters tethered to my primary funding source. Beside her name was a small, unassuming red button. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt the profound singular satisfaction of an equation balancing itself. I clicked the button. A dialog box appeared on the screen asking me to confirm the removal of the authorized user. It warned that any debit cards associated with the user would be deactivated immediately. It stated that all scheduled transfers initiated by the user would be canceled. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. Diane's name vanished from the ledger. In that single digital motion, I severed their access to my capital. The joint account was now locked down, frozen to anyone but me. The debit card currently sitting in my mother's purse was now just a useless piece of plastic. The automatic transfers she had likely scheduled for the upcoming week would bounce. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the ergonomic chair. Outside, the city of Phoenix continued to hum under the dark, arid sky. The temperature was still hovering in the triple digits, a relentless environment that punishes anyone who ventures out without adequate supplies. My parents had just thrown me into that desert. They had no idea they had just handed me the controls to their water supply. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the grid of streetlights. The silent trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to realize the well had run dry. Wednesday morning arrived with a brutal, cloudless sunrise over the Sonoran Desert. I stood in the lobby of my corporate firm in downtown Phoenix, holding a tall iced coffee dressed in a sharp navy blazer. My colleagues hurried past, discussing market yields and quarterly projections. They saw a focused financial manager preparing for the morning briefing. They did not know I had spent the night in a corporate hotel, exiled by my own family. I swiped my security badge and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing me in a cool, quiet steel box. For the next 5 days, I mirrored that controlled environment. I became entirely unreachable. The tension shifted from the explosive confrontation in my parents' kitchen to a suspended, agonizing silence. Ghosting the people who raised you goes against every societal expectation embedded in a daughter. The unwritten rule of American family dynamics dictates that the reliable child must eventually fold. You are expected to act as the emotional shock absorber for the family unit. If a son is kicked out, society frames it as tough love fostering independence. When a daughter leaves, she is labeled cold, bitter, and ungrateful. You are supposed to swallow your pride, apologize for causing a scene, and return to your role as the silent benefactor. I felt the phantom pull of that obligation during the first 48 hours. Sitting in an air-conditioned boardroom on the 20th floor, reviewing a tech startup deficit model, my mind briefly wandered to the house. I pictured my father reading his newspaper, waiting for my inevitable text message. I imagined my mother brewing tea, confident that my guilt would override my dignity. That is how the system had always worked. But I did not reach for my phone. My forensic understanding of numbers anchored me. The ledger I had uncovered the previous night was a factual record of theft. You do not negotiate with embezzlers even if they share your DNA. I let the silence stretch. I weaponized the absence of my voice. While the desert sun baked the concrete outside my office windows, I initiated a series of emotionless financial maneuvers. I started with my own income stream. I logged into my corporate payroll portal. I deleted the routing numbers tied to the old banking institution. I opened a new highly secure account with a private wealth management firm that required dual authentication for every inquiry. I redirected my substantial direct deposits there. The river of capital that had sustained my parents' lifestyle was officially dammed. The money was now protected behind an impenetrable digital wall. Next, I tackled the communication lines. I had managed the family cellular plan for 4 years. It was a convenience they had come to expect, an invisible utility that magically refreshed every month without them ever seeing a bill. I logged into the provider dashboard. I located the numbers assigned to Diane, Richard, and Madison. I did not suspend them temporarily. I selected the permanent disconnect option. The digital confirmation appeared on my screen. I had just severed their ability to call each other, to call their friends, and most importantly, to call me from those lines. The silence I was enforcing was now a technical reality. They were isolated on a grid I no longer funded. The final maneuver required a precise understanding of the Arizona climate. Phoenix in July is a hostile environment. Survival depends entirely on central cooling. The premium air conditioning system at the house ran constantly, keeping the sprawling floor plan at a crisp 72 degrees to accommodate Madison's comfort. The monthly utility bill often exceeded $600 during the peak summer months. I navigated to the local power grid portal. I accessed the payment settings. I removed my primary credit card from the automatic payment schedule. The portal generated an automated warning stating that a failure to process the upcoming payment would result in an immediate service interruption. I knew the timeline for local utility companies. They issue a digital warning, wait a few days, and then throttle the power supply to the residents. I checked a box acknowledging the risk. I logged out. I was not shutting off their power directly. I was simply withdrawing my financial shield, leaving them to face the natural consequences of their environment. The heat of the desert would soon become a physical manifestation of their choices. Days 3 and 4 passed in a state of deliberate pacing. I maintained my corporate routine. I reviewed risk portfolios. I sat in meetings projecting revenue growth for software developers, pointing at charts and explaining profit margins. Nobody in those rooms knew that my most important audit was happening in silence miles away in a residential neighborhood. I ate catered lunches. I drank filtered water. I slept soundly on crisp hotel sheets. Every comfort I experienced was a stark reminder of what I had freely provided to my family and what I had now revoked. My hotel room remained a pristine, temperature-controlled sanctuary. The contrast between my calculated corporate existence and the impending chaos at my parents' home grew sharper with every passing hour. I knew the exact timeline of their realization. Diane would attempt to use the deactivated debit card at her upscale grocery store. The checkout terminal would decline the transaction. She would try to call Richard in a panic from the parking lot. The call would fail because the cellular service was dead. She would return home flustered and indignant, only to discover the utility provider had sent an urgent notice regarding the missed payment. The walls of their comfortable reality were collapsing brick by invisible brick, yet the silence held. The sheer stubbornness of my mother likely prevented her from finding a landline or borrowing a neighbor's phone to contact me immediately. She would assume it was a bank error. She would assume the cell provider made a mistake. People who live off the labor of others rarely possess the self-awareness to recognize when they have pushed their provider too far. They mistake generosity for an unending natural resource. Diane would spend days raging at customer service representatives. She could not reach, entirely blind to the fact that the actual consequence was sitting in a high-rise watching the numbers drop to zero. She still believed she held the power. She still thought Madison was the center of the universe. I sat in my office and let the hours tick by. A financial manager learns that the market always corrects itself eventually. You just have to wait for the bubble to burst. I was perfectly content to wait for the implosion. The morning of the fifth day dawned with a punishing heatwave predicted for the valley. Local news stations warned residents to stay indoors. I arrived at my office early, the sleek glass desk cool beneath my forearms. The city below was already shimmering with thermal distortion, the pavement baking under the early morning sun. I opened a fresh spreadsheet on my monitor, preparing to analyze a new client portfolio. The ambient noise of the firm was a low, comforting hum of productivity. I took a slow sip of my iced coffee, savoring the bitter chill. At exactly 9:14 in the morning, my phone screen illuminated. The device vibrated against the glass surface, breaking the 120-hour silence. A name flashed across the digital display in bright white letters, demanding my attention. Richard. My father was calling. Not Diane, not Madison. The man who had stood silently by the door while I was cast out into the blistering night was finally reaching out. I did not reach for the device. I did not silence the ringer. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, folded my hands in my lap, and stared at the glowing screen. I let it echo in the quiet office, watching the name flash again and again, knowing that the foundation of their entire world had just cracked wide open. I watched the device vibrate on my desk. The name Richard flashed in bright white text against the dark screen. The metallic hum of the motor rattled against the glass surface. I did not reach for it. I did not press the button to send him to voicemail. I simply let the digital summons ring out until the network timed out and the screen went black. A small notification icon appeared a moment later, indicating a recorded message. He was speaking into the void, and I was content to let him stay there. Instead of accessing my voicemail, I moved my hand to the trackpad and opened a secured partition on my hard drive. My corporate role requires managing risk, but the greatest liability in my portfolio was the very structure of my family. I navigated past my retirement accounts and my stock portfolios to a folder labeled Real Estate. I opened a high-resolution file. The document was a warranty deed recorded in Maricopa County. The text confirmed a reality my parents had spent 36 months pretending did not exist. 3 years prior, the family had stood on the precipice of total financial ruin. Madison had convinced our parents to fund a tech venture. She wanted to launch a mobile application designed to connect users with bespoke holistic healers and crystal therapy retreats. She possessed zero coding skills, zero business acumen, and a profound sense of entitlement. She hired expensive freelance developers and rented a sleek co-working space downtown. The project burned through $80,000 of home equity in less than a year before collapsing into a pile of unpaid vendor invoices. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings shortly after. I remember arriving at the house one afternoon to find a bright yellow notice taped to the front door. Diane was inside, sobbing onto the granite island, terrified that her neighbors would discover their insolvency. Richard sat in his armchair, staring at the television without turning it on, paralyzed by his own failure. They were weeks away from losing the property and facing the brutal Arizona summer with nowhere to live. I stepped into the void they created. Using my immaculate credit score and my substantial corporate income, I purchased the house from them in a short sale arrangement, approved by the lender. I paid the closing costs out of my own savings. I assumed the full weight of the mortgage. I became the sole legal owner of the sprawling air-conditioned property they called home. To protect their fragile pride, I allowed them to maintain the illusion of ownership. We never discussed the transaction with extended family. Diane continued to host holiday dinners and complain about her property taxes, and I silently paid the actual bills. I became their landlord, operating a charity housing operation for tenants who despised me. That unspoken arrangement ended the moment Diane ordered me to pack my bags. By casting me out of the kitchen, they had committed an illegal lockout. They had evicted the property owner. Because we never signed a formal lease, their legal status was an at-will tenancy. In the state of Arizona, terminating an undocumented month-to-month tenancy requires a formal 30-day written notice. They had breached the peace of our arrangement, handing me the legal right to sever the relationship permanently. I opened a blank word processing document. My keystrokes were sharp and deliberate in the quiet office. I typed the formal heading for a notice to vacate. I inputted the legal address of the Phoenix property. I cited the relevant state statutes governing the termination of an at-will tenancy. I stipulated that they had exactly 30 days to surrender the premises, hand over all keys, and remove their personal belongings. I paused to consider the reality of what I was drafting. Finding a new rental property in Phoenix during the peak of a July heatwave is a brutal endeavor. The market is fiercely competitive. Property management companies require a credit score of at least 700. They demand proof of income equating to 3 times the monthly rent. They require security deposits, pet deposits, and a pristine rental history. My parents possessed none of these things. Their credit was a graveyard of missed payments and the near foreclosure from 3 years ago. Richard worked a stagnant retail job. Diane had not been employed in 2 decades. Madison contributed nothing but debt. They were fundamentally unrentable. When the 30 days expired, they would face a housing market that did not care about anxiety attacks or linen blouses. The phone on my desk vibrated again. The sudden movement disrupted my focus. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed the name Diane. The pacing had shifted. My father calling was a sign of initial confusion. My mother calling in rapid succession meant the situation at the house had escalated into genuine panic. She was calling multiple times, leaving frantic voicemails, her name lighting up the glass surface like a distress flare. I watched the screen glow, visualizing her pacing the kitchen floor, realizing that the invisible safety net had vanished. I opened a new tab on my web browser and navigated to the local utility provider portal. The dashboard loaded with a prominent red banner displayed across the top of the screen. The power company had processed my request to halt the automatic payment. A digital notice confirmed that the account was now severely past due. The banner explicitly stated that service disconnection was scheduled within the next 24 hours due to non-payment. The central air conditioning unit at the house was a significant drain on the grid. It required a constant flow of capital to keep the interior climate habitable. The power company did not negotiate with tiers. When the utility shut off, the interior temperature of the house would climb to match the lethal desert heat outside. The house would transform from a sanctuary into a sweatbox. Diane called a third time. The urgency was palpable through the silent flashing of the device. The consequences were closing in on them, tightening like a snare. They were trapped in a house they did not own, facing an imminent power failure, with no access to the funds required to fix it. I ignored the call. I clicked back to the word processing document containing the notice to vacate. I reviewed the text one final time to ensure every legal requirement was met. The language was cold, precise, and unyielding. It was a perfect reflection of the boundaries I was erecting. I sent the document to the laser printer sitting on the credenza behind my desk. The machine hummed to life, pulling a fresh sheet of thick white paper from the tray. The ink bonded to the page, making my decision permanent. I stood up and retrieved the printed notice. The paper was still warm from the machine. I opened my leather briefcase and withdrew a pristine manila folder. I slid the notice to vacate inside, aligning the edges perfectly. I placed the folder on the corner of my desk. I was no longer a silent benefactor absorbing their abuse. I was a property owner, preparing to reclaim my asset. The digital lines had been cut, and the physical eviction was now set in motion. I sat back down, watching the utility portal countdown, armed for the coming war. It was 3 in the afternoon when I finally unlocked my phone to review the notifications accumulating on the lock screen. The missed calls from my parents had piled up over the lunch hour, forming a digital stack of rising desperation. I tapped the voicemail icon and selected the most recent message. It was from Richard. For 26 years, my father had communicated entirely through heavy sighs and deferred responsibilities. He preferred to retreat into the background, watching television in his armchair, while my mother directed the household spending and dictated the emotional climate. If a bill went unpaid, he simply handed the unopened envelope to me. Now his voice played through the small speaker of my phone, and that familiar passive detachment was gone. It had been replaced by a tight, reedy panic. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask where I was sleeping, or if I had found a safe place to stay after being thrown out into the Phoenix night. He bypassed basic humanity entirely and demanded to know what was wrong with the bank. He explained, his breath catching in his throat, that a contractor had tried to cash a check that morning. The check was meant to cover the initial materials for a renovation project in the spare bedroom. The spare bedroom was my old room. They were converting the space I had occupied just 5 days ago into a dedicated wellness room for Madison. They had hired a professional to install bamboo flooring, acoustic soundproofing, and ambient lighting, so my sister could have a pristine sanctuary for her guided meditations. My father explained that the bank had rejected the draft. The check had bounced, triggering a severe overdraft penalty that was currently draining the remaining few dollars they had scraped together in their personal checking account. I listened to his frantic recording twice. He sounded bewildered, like a man who had stepped on a stair that was not there. He operated under the assumption that the joint account was a magic well that replenished itself regardless of how much water they drew from it. He told me to call the bank immediately and fix the routing error. He instructed me to wire the funds to the contractor before the man threatened to place a mechanic's lien on the property. I sat in my office and let the recording end. A lien on the property. My father was threatening himself with a legal encumbrance on a house he did not even own. The irony was a bitter, precise thing. I understood exactly how this had happened. They had written the check on Tuesday knowing the balance was insufficient. They had calculated the float time, assuming that my corporate direct deposit would hit the joint account on Friday morning, clearing the contractor's check just in time. It was a classic check-kiting scheme executed at the kitchen island. They had spent money that did not exist, relying on my labor to balance their ledger. I did not return his call. I deleted the voicemail. I pictured the contractor standing in their foyer holding a worthless piece of paper, demanding payment for acoustic panels and Himalayan salt lamps. My parents had spent the last 5 days assuming I was punishing them with a silent tantrum. They believed I was sitting in a cheap motel waiting for permission to come home and resume my duties. Instead, they had just collided head-on with a concrete financial wall. The safety net had been removed and gravity was taking over. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Diane. She did not bother with greetings or pleasantries. Her message arrived in a dense block of furious text. She ordered me to correct the banking malfunction this instant. She claimed the stress of the contractor raising his voice in the hallway had caused Madison to start hyperventilating. According to my mother, my petty financial games were now a direct physical threat to my sister. She described Madison collapsing on the living room sofa, clutching her chest, unable to catch her breath because the flooring installation had been halted. Diane demanded I wire the funds directly to the contractor and apologize to the family for causing such a severe disruption to their peace. The layers of entitlement in her message were breathtaking. She had evicted me into a lethal environment, yet she still expected me to function as her personal payroll department. She treated me like a delinquent employee who had failed to execute a standard task, rather than the benefactor who had subsidized her entire existence. In her mind, my residency in the house was a privilege they had revoked, but my financial obligations to them were a permanent fixture. She genuinely believed she held the upper hand in this negotiation. For years, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxious compliance. I would have logged into the banking portal, transferred the money from my private savings, and composed a lengthy apology just to stop the conflict from escalating. I would have paid the overdraft fee out of my own pocket to ensure Madison felt secure. That is how systemic manipulation functions over time. It conditions the provider to fear the discomfort of the dependent above all else. It trains you to sacrifice your own stability to prevent their manufactured crises. Today, standing in my air-conditioned corporate office, I felt nothing but a cool, clinical detachment. The data was clear. I opened the messaging application. I did not draft an emotional paragraph defending myself. I did not mention the stolen funds, the unauthorized cash withdrawals, or the luxury spa retreats in Sedona. Explanations are a form of negotiation, and giving them a reason to argue would only invite them back into my life. I was finished negotiating. I typed 2 sentences. My financial contributions ended when my residency did. Direct all future correspondence to my attorney. I read the words once to check for clarity. The boundary was icy and absolute. There was no room for interpretation, no opening for a counteroffer. I pressed send. I watched the delivery confirmation appear beneath the text bubble. I knew exactly what would happen next. The shockwave would hit the kitchen in real time. Diane would stare at the screen, unable to comprehend the vocabulary of defiance. She would read the word attorney and realize that the dynamic had permanently shifted. The daughter she had pushed around for a lifetime had just introduced a legal barrier. Before she could even begin to type a response, a different notification popped up on the top corner of my phone screen. It was an alert from the smart home security application I had installed when I purchased the property 3 years ago. The application monitored the environmental systems of the house, allowing me to track energy usage from my phone. I tapped the banner. The dashboard loaded, displaying the real-time climate data for the residents. The local utility company had executed their final warning. The central air conditioning unit had been throttled due to non-payment. In Arizona, during the peak of summer, utility providers do not shut off the power completely to avoid immediate fatalities, but they restrict the current to a baseline minimum. The system could no longer draw enough power to cool the sprawling floor plan. The digital thermostat reading, which usually sat at a comfortable 72 degrees, was already climbing. I watched the numbers change on my screen. It ticked up to 74, then 75. The physical heat of their consequences was literally rising inside the walls of the family home. Without my money to fuel the grid, the lethal desert environment they had thrown me into was now seeping under their doors and through their windows. The air inside the house would soon become heavy, stagnant, and suffocating. They were losing control of their climate. I closed the application and placed the phone face down on my desk, ready to watch the rest of their comfortable reality burn away. The clock on my desktop monitor ticked past noon. Most of my colleagues left the building to grab lunch at the upscale bistros clustered around the financial district. I chose to stay at my desk. I ate a simple salad from the corporate cafeteria and opened a fresh digital workspace. My morning had been dedicated to mitigating risk for a regional tech firm. My lunch hour would be dedicated to auditing my own sister. I am a financial manager. My entire career is built on the premise that capital leaves a footprint. People can lie with their words, their body language, and their theatrical panic attacks. Money cannot lie. Money moves from one ledger to another, dragging the truth behind it, in a trail of routing numbers and merchant codes. Diane had categorized the missing funds as holistic medical expenses, claiming they were necessary treatments to stabilize my sister. I intended to verify those treatments. I started with the vendor names I had pulled from the joint checking account the night before. The $800 charge to Desert Bloom Holistic Center was my first target. A standard web search revealed that Desert Bloom was not a medical clinic or a therapy center. It was an exclusive 5-star luxury spa, tucked into the Red Rock Canyons of Sedona. They did not offer psychiatric care. They offered hot stone massages, premium botanical facials, and guided sunset wine tastings. I leaned closer to my screen, pulling the transaction history further back. Once you find the first irregularity, the entire fraudulent structure begins to reveal itself. I scanned the expenditures from the past 6 months, cross-referencing the cash withdrawals and transfers Diane had authorized. The pattern was sickening in its consistency. During the 3rd week of April, I had worked 60 hours finalizing a quarterly projection model for a client. That same week, Madison had claimed to be bedridden with debilitating anxiety, unable to endure the sound of the television or the hum of the vacuum cleaner. I looked at the bank statement for that specific week. Diane had transferred $1,500 to Madison. 2 days later, a charge cleared for a premium wellness retreat in the high desert. While I was drinking stale coffee and staring at spreadsheets to pay their mortgage, my sister was wrapped in a eucalyptus robe, sipping infused water on my dime. The betrayal shifted from simple negligence to calculated financial abuse. I needed more than just merchant codes to build an airtight ledger. I needed physical proof of her location. Madison maintained a public social media profile curated to reflect her fragile state. She posted generic inspirational quotes and complaints about her nervous system. I knew she also kept a secondary private account for her actual social circle. Getting past the privacy settings required a simple maneuver. I contacted a mutual acquaintance from our university days, a woman who still followed Madison online, but harbored a quiet disdain for her entitlement. I requested a few screenshots for a family project. The acquaintance obliged within 10 minutes. My inbox filled with digital images. I downloaded the files and opened them beside my banking spreadsheet. I began the methodical process of aligning the data. The results were undeniable. On the exact day in May when Diane texted me to keep my voice down because Madison was having a panic attack, my sister had posted a photograph of herself holding a craft cocktail by a pristine infinity pool. The geographic tag confirmed her location at a luxury resort in Scottsdale. In June, when my parents asked me to cover an unexpected medical bill for a specialist, Madison had uploaded a video of herself enjoying a premium botanical mud wrap. I typed the dates, the locations, and the corresponding dollar amounts into my spreadsheet. Every row was a testament to their deceit. I documented the spa days, the expensive dinners, the boutique clothing purchases, disguised as therapeutic aids. They had weaponized mental health to fund a permanent vacation. Any lingering guilt I felt about dropping the house key on the entryway console evaporated in the cool air of my office. You cannot feel remorse for abandoning a parasite. I printed the spreadsheet. I printed the geotagged photographs and the corresponding bank statements. I took the manila folder from the corner of my desk, the one holding the formal eviction notice, and I added the new evidence to the stack. The folder grew thicker, heavier with the weight of undisputed facts. I sat back and took a slow breath. The audit was nearly complete, but my professional instincts told me to check the perimeter one last time. When individuals grow accustomed to spending stolen capital, they inevitably seek larger lines of credit to sustain their lifestyle. I logged into a credit monitoring service I had attached to the Phoenix property address. As the sole legal owner of the home, I receive alerts whenever a financial institution runs a query against the property value. The dashboard loaded, and a bright red notification flagged a recent inquiry. 2 weeks ago, a regional mortgage lender had pulled a property valuation report. I clicked into the details. Richard and Diane had submitted an application for a home equity line of credit. They were attempting to borrow $50,000 against the equity of the house. The sheer audacity of the maneuver left me staring at the monitor in silence. My parents wanted to extract cash from the property to fund whatever extravagant lifestyle Madison demanded next. They had filled out the application, forged ahead with the preliminary approval process, and submitted the paperwork, entirely unaware that their names were nowhere on the title. They truly believed they could leverage an asset they did not own, because they had spent 3 years treating my money as their personal inheritance. The application was currently pending, stalled in the underwriting phase. The banking institution would require a title search before dispensing any funds. During that search, the underwriter would pull the official county records. They would discover that Richard and Diane held zero equity. The application would be rejected, and my parents would likely face severe questions regarding their attempt to encumber an asset they did not possess. They had dug their own financial grave, and they were still asking for a bigger shovel just to keep Madison comfortable in her delusions. I took a moment to analyze the psychological entitlement required to execute such a maneuver. They had grown so accustomed to my silent stewardship that they forgot the legal reality of our arrangement. They confused my willingness to prevent their homelessness with a surrender of my ownership rights. This is the danger of being the reliable family member. Your sacrifices are eventually absorbed into the baseline of their expectations. Your generosity becomes their invisible infrastructure, ignored until it is removed. I printed the credit inquiry alert, the laser printer word delivering the final piece of the puzzle. I took the warm sheet of paper and placed it into the manila folder. The dossier was now a lethal instrument. It contained the formal eviction notice, the undeniable ledger of stolen funds, the photographic evidence of the holistic fraud, and the documented proof of their failed attempt to leverage my real estate. I closed the folder. I smoothed my hand over the heavy paper cover, aligning it perfectly with the edge of my glass desk. The silent investigative phase of my retaliation was over. I had gathered the data. I had quantified the betrayal. Now it was time to let the subjects of the audit feel the consequences of their deficit. Just as I reached for my iced coffee, a sharp, heavy knock echoed against my office door. I paused, my hand hovering over the cup. My corporate firm requires visitors to clear a security checkpoint in the lobby. Unscheduled interruptions are exceptionally rare. The knock came again, louder this time, carrying a distinct, entitled rhythm that did not belong in a professional environment. I pulled my hand back and focused my eyes on the frosted glass of the door, waiting to see who had bypassed the barrier. I stood up and walked toward the frosted glass. I pulled the handle back. Trevor stood in the threshold, his face flushed with the kind of unearned confidence that only thrives in untested men. Trevor was Madison's fiancé. He fancied himself a tech entrepreneur, though his actual income consisted of venture capital he burned through and whatever allowances my sister managed to extract from our parents. He wore pristine designer sneakers and a fitted polo shirt, the uniform of a man who spends his days networking at coffee shops instead of building viable products. His presence in my workplace was a violation of the boundary I had established. He had somehow bypassed the ground floor security checkpoint, likely by tailgating a delivery courier into the elevator bank. Now he was standing on the executive floor of my firm, bringing the toxic dysfunction of my family directly into my sanctuary. The polished marble floors and the hum of corporate productivity did nothing to deter his arrogance. He believed his status as my future brother-in-law granted him diplomatic immunity. "You need to fix this right now," Trevor said, stepping forward. His voice carried down the open corridor, bouncing off the glass partitions. I did not step back. I held my ground, keeping my posture straight and my expression neutral. Analysts and junior partners sitting in the nearby cubicles paused their typing. Heads turned. Trevor wanted an audience. He believed public shaming would force me into compliance. He thought a woman concerned with her professional reputation would do anything to quiet a loud man in her lobby. He miscalculated. "You are acting like a toxic narcissist," Trevor announced, pitching his voice louder. "Madison is at home having a severe medical crisis because you decided to throw a temper tantrum and freeze her accounts. She is your sister Gemma. Her health is failing, and you are literally endangering her life over petty cash. Give me the new routing numbers and the login credentials, now." I looked at him. I observed the sweat beading on his forehead. I noted the tremor in his hands. He was not here acting as a noble protector. I was here because the financial pipeline that funded his comfortable lifestyle alongside my sister had suddenly run dry. Madison had likely sent him to do the dirty work, promising him that I would cower the moment a man raised his voice in my workplace. They assumed my quiet financial stewardship translated to personal cowardice. I turned my head slightly toward the reception desk 20 feet away. I made eye contact with David, our floor security liaison. I gave him a curt, definitive nod. David immediately picked up his desk phone and stepped out from behind his station. The gears of consequence were already turning. I returned my attention to Trevor. I did not whisper. I did not attempt to pacify him. I spoke with the crisp, projecting tone I use during quarterly stakeholder presentations. "Trevor," I said, ensuring my voice resonated down the hallway, "you have bypassed corporate security to enter a private financial institution. You are currently standing in my place of employment, demanding access to funds that do not belong to you, under the threat of public harassment. In the state of Arizona, demanding assets through intimidation is legally defined as extortion." Trevor blinked. His jaw slackened. He had expected me to flush with embarrassment and pull him into my office to hush him. Instead, I had just named a felony in front of 20 witnesses. The buzz of the office had died entire. Everyone was listening. "She needs her treatments," Trevor stammered, his volume dropping a fraction. The swagger was rapidly dissolving. "You know she needs her holistic care." "I know exactly what she needs," I replied, my voice remaining an icy level baseline. "I spent my lunch hour auditing the joint checking account you and my sister have been draining. I possess the geotagged photographs of Madison sipping craft cocktails by an infinity pool in Scottsdale. On the exact same day, she claimed to be bedridden with anxiety. I have the receipts for the premium botanical facials, the hot stone massages, and the luxury retreats in Sedona." I took a single deliberate step toward him. He instinctively took a step back, his designer sneakers squeaking faintly against the marble floor. "Those are not medical treatments," I stated clearly. "That is vacation fraud subsidized by my salary. You and my sister have been treating my bank account like a venture capital fund for your leisure. That funding has been permanently revoked. You will not receive a single dollar, nor will you receive any login credentials. Trevor's face drained of color. The arrogant tech persona vanished, replaced by the panicked realization of a man who just discovered his meal ticket was shredded. He looked around the corridor. My colleagues were watching him with undisguised contempt. He had tried to expose me as a cruel sister. Instead, I had exposed him as a complicit grifter. He realized the optics had flipped entire. You cannot just cut her off, Trevor muttered, though the fight had left his posture. She is family. She is a liability, I corrected him. The heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor swung open. Two uniformed building security officers stepped onto the floor, moving swiftly toward my office. David pointed directly at Trevor. Sir, you are trespassing, the lead officer said, placing a firm hand on Trevor's shoulder. You need to come with us right now. Do not make a scene. Trevor flinched under the officer's grip. He looked at me, searching for any sign of hesitation or regret. He found nothing but the cold, arid gaze of a woman who had spent years balancing unbalanced ledgers. He opened his mouth to issue a parting threat, but the words failed to materialize. The security officers turned him around and escorted him down the hallway. The heavy glass doors shut behind them, cutting off his exit. Silence descended on the executive floor. I turned to my colleagues. I offered a polite professional nod to the junior partners watching from their desks. They nodded back, returning their eyes to their monitors. The disruption was over. The boundary had been tested, and it had held firm. The professional ecosystem recognized a neutralized threat and went back to work. I walked back into my office and closed the frosted glass door. The quiet sanctuary of my workspace enveloped me once again. I walked over to my desk and looked at the manila folder sitting exactly where I had left it. The physical ambush had failed just as spectacularly as the digital harassment. My family possessed no leverage. Their entire strategy relied on my willingness to submit to social pressure, a willingness I had abandoned the moment I drove away from their house in the dark. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and tapped the mouse to wake my computer monitor. The email client on my screen refreshed, downloading a new batch of messages. One specific subject line caught my eye. It was sent from Diane's primary email address. The subject line read, "Urgent. Please read. Family meeting." I clicked the message open. The text lacked the furious, commanding tone of her previous text messages. The bold demands and the accusations of medical endangerment were gone. In their place was a rambling, panicked paragraph, dripping with desperation. The syntax was messy. The grammar ignored a clear sign of a woman typing with shaking hands. Diane wrote that Trevor had just called her from the parking garage of my building. She realized that the intimidation tactic had backfired disastrously. The email was a frantic attempt to execute damage control. She begged me not to take any drastic legal actions. She claimed that things had simply spiraled out of control and that emotions were running too high. She pleaded for a chance to sit down and clear the air like reasonable adults. The shift in her approach was profound. Diane only requested to clear the air when she realized she was choking on her own smoke. She understood that I held the documentation regarding the fraudulent spa trips. She knew that her access to my income was blocked, and the utility company was actively throttling her central cooling system. She was losing her grip on the narrative, and she was terrified of what I might do next. She was attempting to put the genie back into the bottle. I read her groveling words a second time. She wanted a family meeting. She wanted a stage to deploy her tears, to manipulate the timeline, and to guilt me back into compliance. She expected me to meet them at the house, surrounded by her familiar terrain, where she could control the volume and the exit routes. She wanted to play the role of the peacemaker while securing her financial lifeline. I smiled, a thin, humorless expression. I would give them their meeting, but I would dictate the terms, the location, and the agenda. The time for silent defensive maneuvers had passed. I moved my cursor to the reply button, ready to set the coordinates for their final reckoning. I let the email from my mother sit in my inbox, a digital artifact of her failing strategy. I did not click the reply button. I did not offer a time or a location. Silence is a mirror, and I wanted Diane to look at her own reflection for a few more days. When manipulators realize their intimidation tactics hold no weight, they invariably pivot to their most comfortable arena. They attempt to control the external narrative. By Thursday evening, my personal cell phone began to vibrate with a steady, calculated rhythm. The messages did not originate from my parents. They came from the periphery of my family tree. A cousin living in Tucson sent a long paragraph expressing deep concern for my mental well-being. An uncle in Albuquerque texted to ask if I needed a place to stay while I sought psychiatric help. The most telling message arrived from a distant relative in El Paso, urging me not to abandon my vulnerable parents during a severe corporate burnout phase. Diane had deployed her favorite weapon. She had spent the 48 hours since Trevor failed at my office weaving a tragic, elaborate fiction for the extended family across the Southwest. According to her orchestrated rumor mill, the stress of my financial career had finally broken me. I was having a severe psychological episode. I had packed my bags in a fit of irrational rage, cut off my loving parents out of pure spite, and left them scrambling to care for a fragile Madison while I spiraled out of control. It was a brilliant distortion. It framed my mother as a suffering martyr and categorized my boundary as a symptom of mental illness. The natural human instinct when faced with a coordinated smear campaign is to fight back. You want to draft long defensive paragraphs refuting every lie. You want to call every aunt and cousin crying and explaining your side of the dispute. I knew better. In the corporate sector, defending a false accusation with emotional volume only makes the accused look erratic. Liars thrive on engagement. They want you to argue because an argument implies there are two equal sides to the story. I employed total, suffocating silence. I ignored every text message. I did not post a single defense on any social platform. Instead, I selected one specific tactical target. Barbara was my mother's older sister. She lived in a sprawling ranch house in Mesa, and she functioned as the central switchboard for the entire family network. Barbara possessed an insatiable appetite for gossip and a profound inability to keep a secret. If you whispered a piece of information to her over morning coffee, every relative from Phoenix to Santa Fe would possess the details by dinner. I sent Barbara a brief, polite text inviting her to a quiet cafe in Old Town Scottsdale for Saturday morning. I stated that I had a few things to drop off. She agreed immediately, likely thrilled at the prospect of gathering fresh intelligence on my supposed breakdown to report back to Diane. The cafe was cool and softly lit, smelling of roasted espresso beans and citrus. I arrived 10 minutes early and secured a corner booth, positioning myself with my back to the wall. Barbara walked in wearing a bright floral blouse, her expression arranged into a mask of deep, practiced pity. She slid into the booth across from me and reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine. I smoothly retracted my arm to pick up my iced tea. Barbara started her script. She told me how worried everyone was. She lowered her voice, leaning in close, asking if I was taking a leave of absence from my firm. She said Diane was heartbroken, weeping every night over my sudden, cruel departure. She asked what could have possibly driven me to turn my back on the people who raised me. She patted the table, offering a safe space for my inevitable confession. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish painting the tragic portrait. Then I unzipped the sleek leather portfolio resting on the seat beside me. I extracted 3 specific documents. I did not raise my voice. I did not convey an ounce of anger. I allowed the paper to do the heavy lifting. I slid the first document across the polished wood. It was a certified copy of the warranty deed for the Phoenix property. Barbara looked down, her brow furrowing in confusion. She read my name listed as the sole legal owner. She read the date of the transaction from 3 years ago. I watched her eyes widen as the foundational lie of my parents' comfortable existence dissolved in front of her. I placed the second document beside the deed. It was the financial ledger I had compiled, complete with the corresponding bank statements. I pointed a manicured finger at the highlighted cash withdrawals made by Diane. I showed her the transfers flowing directly into Madison's accounts. Finally, I laid down the physical photographs. High-resolution geotagged images of Madison lounging by infinity pools and indulging in premium botanical facials at 5-star Sedona resorts. Beside the photographs, I placed the bounced check Richard had written to the flooring contractor for the home renovation they tried to fund with empty accounts. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone. I explained that I did not suffer a mental breakdown. I explained that I had subsidized their entire lives, prevented their foreclosure, and paid their utility bills until they decided to evict me into a 115-degree heat wave so they could drain my assets without supervision. I told her I was simply showing her the truth before I listed the property for sale and initiated the eviction proceedings. Barbara sat frozen. The cognitive dissonance hit her like a physical force. She looked at the deed, then at the photographs, then back at the deed. The tragic narrative Diane had fed her crumbled under the weight of empirical data. The evidence was irrefutable. I did not ask Barbara to keep a secret. I did not ask her to take my side. I simply paid the bill, gathered my portfolio, and walked out into the bright Arizona morning. I drove back to my hotel knowing the mechanism was in motion. Within an hour, Barbara would be on the phone. She would call her sisters, her nieces, and her cousins. She would describe the deed. She would detail the spa receipts. The truth would spread through the arid family network like a wildfire catching dry brush. Diane had relied on social manipulation, assuming I would hide in shame. I had used her own sister to detonate her reputation. The weekend progressed, and the temperature inside my parents' house must have reached a boiling point. The utility company had kept their central cooling system throttled. They were trapped in a sweltering home they did not own, fielding incoming calls from relatives who suddenly had very pointed questions about their finances and my sister's miraculous spa recoveries. The false narrative collapsed completely, leaving them exposed and humiliated in front of the very people they had tried to turn against me. On Sunday evening, the silence on my phone broke again. This time it was a direct phone call from Diane. She bypassed text messages and emails. She let the phone ring, and for the first time in a week I answered. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the line connect. Diane was crying. It was not the theatrical, practiced weeping she used to manipulate my father. It was a raw, breathless panic. The arrogance had been stripped away by the severe heat of her consequences. She begged me to speak to her. She pleaded for a face-to-face meeting, promising she would explain everything, promising she would make Madison apologize, promising whatever concession she thought would restore her access to my bank accounts. Her voice cracked as she begged me to name a time and a place. The hunt was over and the trap was ready to spring. I held the cellular device to my ear, listening to the fractured rhythm of my mother crying. The desperation was a tangible vibration through the receiver. Diane pleaded for a location. She promised total reconciliation. She swore Madison would apologize for the inconvenience and that we could go back to the way things were. I did not offer forgiveness, nor did I provide comfort. I remained a silent, unyielding presence on the line until her panicked rambling slowed into exhausted silence. I provided an address for a quiet, high-end restaurant in Scottsdale and a specific time for the following afternoon. I disconnected the call before she could express her manufactured gratitude. The social demolition I had orchestrated through my aunt was highly effective, but social consequences are fragile. Reputations can be rebuilt with a few well-placed tears and a compelling new lie. Legal consequences, however, are permanent. I needed a mechanism that tears could not wash away. On Monday morning, I walked into a glass-paneled conference room in a towering building in downtown Phoenix. The view from the window showcased the sprawling arid valley, a landscape defined by harsh survival. Marcus Reed sat at the head of the polished mahogany table. He was a real estate litigator who specialized in high-conflict property disputes. He wore a crisp charcoal suit and possessed a demeanor entirely devoid of empathy. I was a professional mechanic of the law, a man who dismantled broken contracts for a living. I placed the warranty deed, the mortgage statements, and the utility logs in front of him. Marcus reviewed the paperwork with forensic silence, tapping a premium pen against his legal pad. He outlined the precise legal realities of my situation. The property law in Arizona is unsentimental and exacting. Because my parents had expelled me from a residence I legally owned without providing proper written notice, they had committed an illegal lockout. They had violated my statutory rights as the property owner. Furthermore, because we had never established a formal lease agreement, their residency status was classified as an at-will tenancy. They possessed no long-term claim to the structure. They were guests who had just evicted their host. Marcus reached for his keyboard, prepared to draft a standard 30-day notice to quit. I raised my hand and stopped him. A simple eviction document bearing my personal signature was insufficient. If I handed them a notice with my name on the bottom line, Diane would weaponize it. She would bring the paper into a courtroom and weep in front of a magistrate. She would leverage her maternal status, pleading that her cruel daughter was throwing her elderly parents and sick child onto the unforgiving street. I required an impenetrable legal barrier. I instructed Marcus to execute a quitclaim deed immediately. We were going to transfer the title of the Phoenix residence from my personal name into an anonymous limited liability company. I had registered the corporate entity the previous evening under a generic holding title. By moving the asset into a corporate structure, I severed the emotional tether binding me to the property. My parents would no longer be dealing with the daughter they raised. They would be dealing with a faceless property management firm that possessed zero capacity for guilt. The corporate veil would shield me from any manipulative counterclaims and transform a family dispute into a sterile business transaction. Marcus nodded, his expression registering a flicker of professional respect. He began drafting the articles of transfer. While the law clerk finalized the property documents, I opened my leather briefcase. I produced the financial ledger, the geotagged photographs of my sister, and the bank statements detailing the unauthorized cash withdrawals. I spread the evidence across the mahogany table. I instructed Marcus to draft a formal demand for financial restitution. The document outlined the exact sum stolen from the joint checking account over the past 6 months. The legal language categorized the spa trips, the botanical facials, and the luxury resort stays as fraudulent misappropriation of funds. The demand stipulated that if my parents failed to repay the balance in full, within a specified time frame, the corporate entity would pursue a civil judgment. We would attach a lien to any future income they might acquire, and we would request wage garnishment if necessary. The paperwork stripped away their comfortable delusion. It transformed their holistic medical expenses into documented financial theft. There was no room for anxiety attacks in a civil judgment. Marcus compiled the final paperwork. The stack included the 30-day notice to quit, the formal demand for financial restitution, and the proof of title transfer indicating the new corporate ownership. He collated the heavy, crisp pages and slid them into a thick, certified envelope. He ran his hand over the adhesive flap, sealing their fate inside a stiff cardboard sleeve. I did not want the documents sent through the standard postal service. A mailed envelope could be ignored, delayed, or conveniently lost in the shuffle of their daily denial. I provided Marcus with the exact address of the Scottsdale restaurant where my family was expecting a tearful reunion. I retained a premium private courier service. We scheduled the delivery for the exact moment I planned to be seated at the table with them. I provided specific instructions for the courier to approach the table and hand the package directly to my father. The legal strike was calibrated to land in perfect synchronization with my verbal confrontation. I wanted them to hear the truth and hold the physical consequences simultaneously. I wanted the trap to spring shut while they were looking me in the eye. I left the law firm and returned to my corporate hotel room. The digital clock on the bedside table indicated I had 2 hours before the meeting. The silence of the room was a stark contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. I laid my clothing out on the pristine white duvet. I did not select a casual outfit designed to project comfort or familiarity. I chose a sharp, tailored gray suit. The garment was woven from premium wool cut with exacting precision and designed for high-stakes corporate warfare. I secured my hair into a tight, practical knot at the base of my neck. I applied minimal makeup, ensuring my expression remained stark and unreadable. I strapped a heavy silver watch to my wrist, the cool metal grounding me in the present moment. The suit was my armor for the final battle. It signaled that the daughter who paid their bills in the shadows no longer existed. Only the financial manager remained. I smoothed the lapels, checked my reflection in the mirror, and picked up my briefcase. I walked through the hotel lobby, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic tempo against the polished marble floor. The automatic doors slid open, and I stepped out into the scorching afternoon. The temperature hovered at a blistering 115 degrees. The dry desert air burned my lungs on the first inhalation, drawing the moisture from my skin in seconds. I welcomed the severe heat. It was a perfect reflection of the environment I was about to create for the people who had tried to discard me. I handed my parking ticket to the valet, my posture perfectly straight, fully prepared to deliver ruin. The restaurant in Scottsdale was a calculated choice. I selected a dining establishment renowned for its hushed acoustics, dim lighting, and premium pricing. Heavy linen tablecloths draped over circular booths. Crystal water goblets caught the ambient light from the tasteful chandeliers overhead. The climate control system hummed efficiently, keeping the interior temperature at a frigid 68 degrees. I arrived 20 minutes early and requested a booth in the back corner of the room facing the entrance. This specific location stripped my family of their home court advantage. They could not retreat to their bedrooms when the conversation became difficult. They could not raise their voices to intimidate me without violating the unspoken social contract of a fine dining establishment. They were forced to operate on my terrain, governed by my rules of engagement. I sat in my tailored gray suit sipping ice water and watched the hostess guide them through the dining room. The physical toll of the last 5 days was immediately apparent. Richard wore a wrinkled polo shirt and his forehead gleamed with the sheen of perspiration. The utility company had kept their central cooling system restricted, transforming the Phoenix property into a stagnant oven. The brutal desert heat had eroded his usual passive comfort. Diane trailed behind him, her polished demeanor fraying at the edges. Her hair hung flat against her neck, lacking its usual volume. She clutched her designer handbag tight against her ribs like a flotation device. Madison brought up the rear, fully committed to her theatrical victimhood. She wore oversized dark sunglasses indoors, shielding her eyes from an imaginary glare. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her left hand, dabbing at her dry cheeks. They looked like refugees from a suburban war they had started and subsequently lost. They slid into the curved leather booth across from me. The visual contrast between my pristine corporate armor and their wilted, heat-exhausted clothing established the power dynamic before a single syllable was spoken. A waiter approached in a crisp white apron, pouring ice water into their empty goblets. My family drank greedily. The cold water offered temporary relief from the environmental consequences they had been enduring inside the uncooled house. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch across the linen tablecloth, forcing them to initiate the negotiation. Richard cleared his throat. He placed his hands flat on the table, attempting to project a patriarchal authority he had never truly possessed. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, and his attempt to mimic command was deeply unconvincing. Gemma. My father began, his voice lacking its usual resonance. We are ready to let you come home if you apologize. The sheer scale of his delusion hung in the chilled air. He had walked into a luxury restaurant sweating from a broken air conditioner he could not afford to fix, and offered me the privilege of returning to my former role as his financial hostage. I did not laugh. I did not correct him. I reached for my crystal goblet and took a slow, measured sip of ice water. I placed the glass back onto the coaster, aligning it perfectly with the edge. I looked at him, keeping my expression a blank, unreadable ledger. Diane interpreted my silence as submission. She leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to secure her funding. She put on a facade of forgiving magnanimity, a tone she reserved for moments when she believed she had successfully manipulated a situation in her favor. Your father is right, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We know you have been under a lot of stress at work. Corporate life changes people. We are willing to overlook your erratic behavior over the past week, but we need to establish some ground rules moving forward. I maintained my rigid posture. I nodded once, a minimal gesture signaling them to continue. When an opponent is constructing their own trap, you hand them the materials and step out of the way. I wanted them to lay out their terms. I wanted them to articulate every greedy, entitled demand out loud. I wanted their extortion recorded in the quiet acoustics of the room. Diane unzipped her handbag and produced a small leather-bound notebook. She had actually drafted a checklist of conditions for my surrender. First, she stated, tracing a manicured finger down the page, the automatic payments for the utility grid and the cellular plan need to be reinstated today. The power company made a terrible error and the house is uncomfortably warm. Madison is suffering. Madison sniffled loudly on cue. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and pressed the tissue to her nose, refusing to look directly at me. Her performance was a crucial component of their negotiation strategy. Her manufactured fragility was the currency they used to buy my compliance. Second, Diane continued, her confidence growing with every unchecked sentence. The banking issue must be resolved. The check your father wrote to the contractor bounced, and the renovation project is stalled. We need you to transfer the funds to cover the acoustic soundproofing and the bamboo flooring for the wellness room by tomorrow morning. Madison cannot be expected to heal in a construction zone. Diane paused, saving her most crucial demand for the conclusion of her presentation. She folded her hands on top of the notebook and looked at me with an expression of profound maternal disappointment. Finally, you owe your sister a formal apology. You walked out on this family. You abandoned her during a critical phase of her recovery. We expect you to acknowledge the pain you caused and promise that it will never happen again. They finished their presentation. The list was complete. They sat back in the booth waiting for my capitulation. They expected tears of remorse. They expected me to reach into my briefcase, pull out my checkbook, and beg for their forgiveness. They believed the transaction was finalized, and their comfortable reality would resume immediately. The pacing of the room slowed to a crawl. I listened to the clinking of silverware from adjacent tables. I listened to the low murmur of other patrons enjoying their expensive lunches. I let the silence coat our table heavy and impenetrable. I let the agonizing tension build in the space between us. I analyzed their faces. Richard looked relieved, believing he had successfully executed his authoritative role. Diane looked triumphant, certain that her manipulation had secured her financial lifeline for another year. Madison just looked bored, eager for the funds to clear so she could resume her leisure activities. They had learned nothing. The blistering heat of their uncooled house had not inspired a single moment of introspection. It had only fueled their entitlement. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as a malfunctioning appliance that required a firm strike to resume dispensing cash. I kept my eyes fixed on my mother. I did not speak a word to disrupt her false sense of victory. I let them sit in the hollow comfort of their delusion for another 60 seconds. Then a sudden movement near the restaurant entrance caught my peripheral vision. I shifted my gaze toward the reception desk at the front of the dining room. A man wearing a dark professional uniform stepped through the heavy glass doors. He carried a digital signature pad in his left hand and a thick, rigid cardboard envelope in his right hand. The envelope was branded with the logo of the premium private courier service my attorney had hired that morning. The courier approached the host stand, speaking quietly to the maitre d'. The host nodded without smiling and pointed a discreet finger toward the back corner of the dining room, directing the courier precisely toward our booth. The timing was flawless. The legal strike was approaching the table just as they finished articulating their greed. I turned my attention back to my father. He noticed my shifted focus and glanced over his shoulder. The trap was primed. The heavy certified envelope containing the documentation that would dismantle their lives was 30 feet away and closing in fast. The courier navigated the perimeter of the dining room, holding the thick cardboard envelope against his dark uniform. I raised my right hand, catching his eye, and offered a subtle motion instructing him to wait by the service station. He nodded and stepped back into the shadows near the kitchen entrance. My family did not notice the exchange. They remained hyper-focused on the leather-bound notebook sitting on the linen tablecloth waiting for my capitulation. I reached down to the floor and lifted my briefcase onto my lap. The brass clasps opened with a sharp synchronized click. The sound cut through the soft ambient noise of the restaurant. I reached inside and retrieved a sleek black binder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, pushing my mother Diane and her handwritten checklist of demands aside. The binder contained 80 pages of heavily audited financial records providing a comprehensive mapping of their deceit. "I am not reinstating the utility payments," I said. My voice was calm, leveled to the precise frequency I use when presenting a deficit report to a corporate board of directors. "I am not transferring funds to your contractor, and I am certainly not issuing an apology." Diane opened her mouth to object, her posture stiffening with rehearsed indignation. I placed my hand flat on the cover of the binder, creating a physical barrier that commanded silence. "You stated that Madison requires funds to heal," I continued. "I spent my lunch hour reviewing the specific invoices associated with her healing process." I flipped the binder open to the first tabbed section. The spreadsheet detailed every transaction processed through our joint checking account over the last 6 months. I highlighted the relevant rows in bright yellow ink, creating a visual guide for the audit. "On April 12th, you called me at my office and requested I cover an emergency psychiatric evaluation for Madison. You claimed she was bedridden and unable to tolerate natural light. 2 days later, a withdrawal of $1,200 cleared the account." I ran my finger across the printed row, tracing the capital flow from the ledger to the merchant codes. That money was not remitted to a medical provider. It was spent at a luxury resort in Sedona. The merchant categorization codes indicate purchases at their premium botanical spa, a designer apparel boutique, and a 5-star dining establishment. Madison shifted in the leather booth. Her hand drifted away from the crumpled tissue she had been holding to her face. The theatrical sorrow evaporated from her posture, replaced by a rigid, visceral panic. I turned the page. "On May 18th, Diane, you requested another $1,500. You categorized the request as an urgent holistic treatment necessary to prevent a severe anxiety attack. The bank routing numbers show that cash moved directly into a secondary account registered to Madison, and 48 hours later it funded an exclusive desert retreat for 2 people." Madison went entirely pale. The oversized sunglasses slipped down her nose, revealing wide, terrified eyes. Her fragile facade crumbled under the weight of empirical data. Her jaw moved, but she only managed a faint, panicked stammer, unable to formulate a coherent defense. She looked at our mother silently, begging for an intervention. Diane scrambled to salvage the narrative. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "You do not understand the treatment protocol," Diane insisted. Her voice adopted a frantic high pitch that drew glances from the adjacent tables. "Those excursions were therapeutic necessities. The doctors recommended a change of scenery to calm her nervous system. It was part of her prescribed recovery plan. You cannot judge a medical strategy you do not comprehend." I did not argue with her clinical assessment. I simply turned to the second tab in the binder. I extracted a stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. I spread them across the white tablecloth, fanning them out so every detail was visible under the crystal chandelier. The images were pulled directly from the hidden social media profile I had breached. The geotags were printed clearly in the bottom corner of every page, verifying the exact longitude, latitude, and time of capture. The first photograph showed Madison wearing a designer swimsuit, holding a craft cocktail, and laughing beside an infinity pool in Scottsdale. The timestamp matched the exact afternoon she was supposedly immobilized by a panic attack. The second image captured Madison and her fiancé, Trevor, clinking champagne flutes at a premium steakhouse downtown. The third photograph showed them posing on a guided off-road tour in the Red Rocks, radiant and untroubled by any psychological distress. "Your prescribed recovery plan involves an alarming amount of top-shelf liquor," I noted, pointing to the cocktail glasses. "These photographs verify that my income did not fund medical stability. My income subsidized a permanent, fraudulent vacation for a sister who weaponized mental health to avoid gaining employment." Richard leaned forward. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the photograph of Madison and Trevor at the steakhouse. My father had spent the last 3 years believing my mother and her financial reports. He had trusted her accounting, assuming the constant strain on their budget was the unfortunate cost of raising a chronically ill child. He read the timestamp on the image. He read the location tag. He looked at the spreadsheets sitting in the center of the table, processing the columns of unauthorized cash withdrawals. The realization hit him with a visible physical force. He turned his head slowly, looking at Diane with an expression of profound betrayal. You told me the bank account was empty because Gemma was withholding her share of the household expenses, Richard said. His voice was hollow, stripped of the authoritative tone he had attempted to project earlier. You told me we could not afford to fix the roof because her medical bills were draining our savings. Diane shrank back against the leather upholstery trapped between her husband and my meticulous documentation. Richard, please, she stammered, her eyes darting around the restaurant. I was only trying to protect our daughter. You know how sensitive she is. You stole from our other daughter to pay for hotel rooms, he replied, dropping the photograph onto the table. The unified front they had carried into the restaurant shattered into jagged pieces. The parents who had always stood shoulder to shoulder in their demands were now staring at each other across a chasm of financial deceit. The family unity dissolved right at the table, leaving nothing but resentment and exposure. I watched the architecture of their marriage buckle. I folded my hands together, resting them on the edge of the binder. You built a comfortable life on a foundation of my labor, I said, ensuring my words reached all three of them. I paid the mortgage deficit, I funded the air conditioning, I provided the safety net. When I finally became an inconvenience to your scam, you did not just ask me to leave. You threw me out into a 115-degree heatwave. You cast your only reliable daughter into the desert night to protect a lie. Madison began to cry, and for the first time in her life, the tears were genuine. They were born of terror, not manipulation. She realized her primary funding source was permanently severed, and her parents could no longer shield her from the financial reality of adulthood. Diane buried her face in her hands, recognizing that her social currency and her reputation were disintegrating in real time. The audit was complete. The verbal confrontation had achieved its purpose. I looked past the ruined dynamic at my table and found the courier standing patiently by the service station. I raised my hand and signaled him to approach. He walked across the dining room, his rubber-soled shoes silent against the hardwood floor. He carried the heavy certified envelope containing the legal framework of their ruin. He stopped at the edge of our booth. I pointed a single finger at my father, directing the courier toward the man who had stood by the door and watched me walk into the heat. Delivery for Richard Bennett, the courier stated, extending the rigid cardboard envelope over the linen tablecloth. Richard stared at the rigid cardboard envelope hovering over his crystal water goblet. His hands remained flat on the heavy linen tablecloth. He looked at the uniformed courier in profound confusion, then shifted his gaze back to me, searching my face for context. I offered no explanation. The courier placed the certified package directly onto the pristine white ceramic plate in front of my father, nodded once in my direction, and retreated silently toward the kitchen doors. The soft acoustic hum of the dining room seemed to amplify the silence settling over our booth. My father reached forward. His fingers caught the edge of the red adhesive pull tab. He tore it open. The tearing sound ripped through the quiet space, sharp and definitive. He extracted a dense stack of legal paper bound by a heavy brass clip. He placed the stack on the table and stared at the topmost page. It was the warranty deed recorded in Maricopa County. The bold text at the top of the page indicated a formal transfer of real property. Richard adjusted his posture, squinting at the fine print. He read the address of the house he had occupied for 2 decades. Then he read the name of the designated owner. It was not his name. It was not Diane joining his name. The listed proprietor was Desert Shield Holdings, LLC. He looked up, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the corporate designation. He asked who owned the holding company. I informed him that I was the sole managing member. I watched the cognitive gears grind to a halt behind his eyes. He asked how a corporate entity could own the residence he purchased 20 years ago. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I explained the financial reality that had governed our lives for the past 36 months. 3 years prior, his retail income had stagnated, and Madison had launched a failed mobile application venture that drained every ounce of equity they possessed. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings. A bright yellow notice of default had been taped to their front door. I told him I had intervened to prevent their homelessness. I purchased the property via a short sale arrangement, absorbing the closing costs and assuming the full weight of the mortgage. I became the sole legal owner of the structure. I allowed them to continue living there to spare them the humiliation of public ruin. I shifted my attention to my mother. Diane sat paralyzed, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. I revealed the deepest layer of the deception to my father. Diane had known about the transaction. She had signed the requisite paperwork to relinquish the title. However, she had orchestrated a secondary layer of deceit. She chose to conceal the transfer from Richard to protect his fragile ego. She wanted him to believe he was still the patriarch, still the provider, while I silently subsidized his illusion of ownership. The revelation struck my father like a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. He stared at his wife, realizing the woman sitting beside him had not only stolen funds to indulge their youngest child, but had also stripped him of his only tangible asset and lied about it for 3 years. His entire identity dissolved in the span of a single conversation. I instructed Richard to turn to the next page in the stack. His hands trembled as he flipped the heavy parchment. The second document featured a bold, undeniable heading. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate. I outlined the legal mechanics of our new dynamic. Because we had never executed a formal lease agreement, their residency status in Arizona was classified as an at-will tenancy. When Diane cornered me in the kitchen and demanded I pack my belongings, she committed an illegal lockout. My parents had evicted their landlord from a property they occupied merely by my grace. That singular hostile action severed our unspoken social contract. I informed them that the holding company was listing the house for sale immediately. They had exactly 1 month to secure alternative lodging, pack their possessions, and vacate the premises. I painted a precise picture of their impending logistical nightmare. The Phoenix housing market is unforgiving during the peak summer season. Securing a new rental property requires a pristine credit score, substantial security deposits, and verifiable proof of income, equating to 3 times the monthly rent. They possessed a graveyard of missed payments, a recent history of near foreclosure, and zero liquid capital. When the 30 days expired, they would be forced to navigate a hostile real estate market with no safety net. They would have to pack a 30-year life into cardboard boxes, while the interior temperature of their uncooled house mirrored the lethal desert heat. Diane began to hyperventilate. This was not a theatrical performance designed to manipulate a sympathetic audience. It was a genuine visceral panic attack. Her chest heaved, pulling shallow gasps of air into her lungs. The realization that she had orchestrated her own ruin crashed down upon her. She had traded her permanent housing security for a few superficial spa trips and a fabricated sense of control. She grasped at her chest, her carefully maintained social facade disintegrating under the fluorescent lighting. She looked around the restaurant, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Beside her, Madison shrank into the leather upholstery. The oversized sunglasses could not hide the terror radiating from her rigid posture. My sister finally understood the gravity of the situation. The invisible bank vault she had raided for years was permanently sealed. Her primary funding source was gone, and her parents were entirely unequipped to sustain her luxurious lifestyle. She was a dependent tethered to a sinking ship, and the water was rising fast. They sat together in the booth, surrounded by crystal goblets and heavy linen drowning in the wreckage of their own entitlement. I placed my hands on the table and pushed myself up from the booth. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored gray suit, ensuring the fabric draped perfectly. The power dynamic in the room had inverted permanently. I looked down at the 3 individuals who had treated my financial stewardship as an unlimited utility. I did not offer a closing insult. I did not raise my voice to deliver a dramatic parting shot. The meticulously drafted legal documents resting on their plates were far more eloquent than any insult I could devise. I picked up my leather briefcase. I turned my back on my family and walked toward the restaurant exit. My heels clicked a steady rhythmic tempo against the hardwood floor, echoing a quiet victory. The host opened the heavy glass door for me. I stepped over the threshold and walked out into the blistering afternoon. The Arizona sun beat down on the pavement, generating a suffocating wave of thermal energy. The temperature hovered near 115 degrees. The dry desert air burned my lungs on the first inhalation, but it did not feel oppressive. It felt expansive. For the first time in 3 years, I was no longer carrying the weight of their survival. I stood in the scorching sunlight, took a deep breath, and felt nothing but profound, unadulterated freedom. The digital log on my phone documented their descent. Tuesday brought 14 missed calls. Wednesday delivered 20. I watched the notifications stack up on the illuminated glass, a silent testament to the walls closing in around them. I did not engage. I spent my days analyzing corporate mergers and my evenings organizing the layout of my new townhome. The Phoenix heatwave stretched through the week, turning the city into a kiln. My parents were trapped inside a structure they no longer controlled, facing a logistical puzzle they lacked the resources to solve. Securing a new lease in Maricopa County requires a specific financial anatomy. Landlords demand a credit score exceeding 650. They require pay stubs proving an income triple the monthly rent. Richard possessed a stagnant retail wage and a credit history scarred by their near foreclosure 3 years prior. Diane had zero income. Every application they submitted incurred a non-refundable fee, slowly draining the meager cash reserves they had salvaged. Each rejection arrived like a rhythmic drumbeat, confirming their unrentable status. The property management firms did not care about the linen blouses or the curated social image. They only cared about the math, and the math indicated my parents were a severe liability. Desperation eventually forces proud people to beg. Diane reached out to the extended family network. She called cousins in Tucson and aunts in Flagstaff, hoping to secure a temporary spare bedroom or a short-term loan. She found nothing but dial tones and polite, icy refusals. Aunt Barbara had executed her role with devastating efficiency. The photocopied spa receipts and the property deed had circulated through the family grapevine. Relatives who had initially sent me concerned text messages about my mental health now understood the scope of the fraud. Diane attempted to spin a new tale of victimization, but the concrete evidence acted as a firewall. Her social currency was bankrupt. The safety nets she thought she possessed vanished the moment the truth saw the light of day. Faced with systemic rejection, my mother retreated into denial. She decided to squat. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked in the driveway at all hours, the blinds drawn tight against the sun. She refused to purchase cardboard boxes. She believed that if she simply ignored the legal notice, the problem would evaporate. She assumed the friction of forcing her out would be too much for me to bear. She underestimated the clinical efficiency of a limited liability company. I did not drive to the house to argue with her. I authorized the property management firm representing my holding company to initiate the pre-sale protocol. On Thursday morning, a commercial van pulled up to the curb. 2 contractors stepped onto the scorched grass. They did not knock on the front door to ask for permission. They drove a wooden post deep into the front yard, attaching a bright reflective sign that read, "For sale." Another technician walked up to the entryway and secured a heavy steel lockbox around the handle. The installation was a public, undeniable broadcast to the entire subdivision. The neighborhood now knew the house was hitting the market. Diane could no longer pretend she was merely redecorating. The illusion of her suburban success was publicly dismantled. The physical reality of the sign fractured the remaining loyalty inside the house. Madison possessed a keen survival instinct tailored exclusively to her own comfort. The throttled air conditioning had raised the indoor climate to an unlivable temperature. The luxury funds were severed. Her parents were sinking and she had no intention of drowning with them. On Friday afternoon, my security application sent an alert from the driveway camera. I opened the video feed on my monitor. Trevor had pulled his car up to the garage. Madison walked out the front door dragging 2 oversized designer suitcases I had unknowingly paid for. She did not look back at the house. She did not hug her mother. The golden child whose fragile health had required so much financial cultivation abandoned her caregivers the moment the money stopped flowing. She loaded her luggage into the trunk and rode away, proving her devotion was purely transactional. Diane was left standing on the porch watching her ultimate investment drive off into the heat. The departure broke whatever resolve remained in my father. Saturday morning, my phone vibrated with a call from Richard. I answered by passing the greeting. The voice on the other end sounded aged, stripped of the hollow authority he usually tried to project. He did not ask for money. He did not demand I reverse the eviction. He called to offer a genuine apology. He admitted he had been a coward. He confessed he had allowed Diane to direct the narrative because fighting her required an energy he did not possess. He apologized for standing by the door while I walked out into the night. I listened to his admission. It was the most honest conversation we had shared in a decade. I accepted his apology. I told him I appreciated his willingness to acknowledge his failure. Then I informed him the sale of the property was proceeding exactly as scheduled. Forgiveness is an emotional process, but eviction is a legal one. Understanding his cowardice did not obligate me to continue funding it. He sighed a heavy, resigned sound and thanked me for picking up the phone. The line disconnected, finalizing the severance. The final 2 weeks of the month documented their agonizing logistical nightmare. Without Madison, and without the illusion of a rescue, Richard and Diane were forced to dismantle their 30-year life manually. They had to sort through decades of accumulated possessions inside a house that felt like a furnace. The utility company maintained the restricted power supply. The indoor temperature hovered around 85 degrees. Every cardboard box they packed required physical exertion in a stifling, stagnant environment. They were sweating over photo albums and wrapping fragile dishware in old newspapers, feeling the oppressive weight of their consequences. The dust from the attic mixed with the stagnant air, creating a suffocating atmosphere. They had to decide what to discard and what to keep, knowing their next destination would be significantly smaller and far less comfortable. It was a slow, undeniable reckoning. They were packing up a comfortable life they had stolen, boxing up the remnants of a delusion they could no longer afford. The manual labor served as a physical manifestation of their debt. I did not take pleasure in their physical discomfort, but I recognized the necessity of the ordeal. They were finally experiencing the friction of reality. While they taped boxes and wiped sweat from their brows, I sat in my pristine, climate-controlled office. I opened the real estate portal on my secondary monitor. The listing for the Phoenix property had gone live. The market was highly competitive, driven by a shortage of available inventory in that specific zip code. I watched the screen as the first lucrative cash offers began to roll into the inbox. The numbers balanced perfectly, reflecting the true value of an asset cleared of its toxic liabilities. The final day of the 30-day notice arrived with punishing meteorological precision. The local weather networks broadcasted excessive heat warnings across the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. By 10 in the morning, the ambient temperature reached 118 degrees. The asphalt streets radiated thermal energy in visible, shimmering waves. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and inherently dangerous for prolonged physical exertion. I sat in my corporate office on the 22nd floor, insulated behind tinted, double-paned glass. The climate control system hummed a steady, quiet rhythm, maintaining a crisp 68 degrees in my workspace. I did not drive out to the suburban property to watch my parents vacate the premises. Gloating requires an emotional investment, a desire to feed off the reactions of the people who wronged you. I had no interest in absorbing their residual anger or witnessing their tears. Instead, I operated through the sterile, detached mechanism of my property management firm. I hired an independent inspector named Marcus. His mandate was straightforward. He was instructed to wait across the street, verify that the occupants surrendered the property by the noon deadline, document the structural condition of the empty house, and change the locks. At 12:15, my email client chimed with an incoming message from Marcus. He had uploaded a digital field report containing time-stamped high-resolution photographs. I opened the secure portal and maximized the browser window on my secondary monitor. The visual contrast between my pristine high-rise sanctuary and the scene unfolding in the images was stark. The first photograph captured the driveway. A faded, rented box truck sat parked on the concrete, the rear loading ramp extended onto the scorched grass. My father stood near the base of the ramp, struggling to balance a heavy wooden dresser. His light-colored shirt was soaked with dark patches of perspiration. His posture was hunched, his face drawn tight with the strain of manual labor in a lethal environment. Richard had spent his entire adulthood avoiding friction, deferring every difficult task to the women in his house. Now facing an unyielding deadline with no financial leverage to hire professional movers, he was forced to bear the physical weight of his own displacement. The second image brought a sharp sense of closure. Diane was captured walking down the front path carrying a single decorative lamp and a plastic garbage bag filled with clothing. Her carefully curated suburban socialite image had completely melted away under the punishing Arizona sun. Her hair clung flat to her forehead, damp with sweat. Her shoulders slumped. They were loading the remnants of a 30-year delusion into a cramped cargo space, packing up the comfortable existence they had sabotaged. They were not moving to a comparable subdivision. The family grapevine, fueled by Aunt Barbara's relentless networking, provided me with the details of their new destination. Without my pristine credit score to secure a premium lease, they had been rejected by every reputable property management company in the county. They eventually found a private landlord willing to overlook their abysmal financial history in exchange for an exorbitant security deposit. They were relocating to a cramped substandard two-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city, bordering a loud interstate highway. The complex was notorious for its failing infrastructure and lack of premium amenities. Watching them load the truck through the digital lens of the inspector, I felt a profound sense of clarity. I felt no guilt. I did not ruin them. I did not orchestrate their debt. I did not force them to drain their equity to fund a fraudulent, holistic lifestyle for my sister. I merely stopped functioning as their shield. When you remove a load-bearing pillar from a rotten structure, the collapse is a natural consequence, not an act of vengeance. I stepped out of the way, and gravity did the rest. The digital report also contained photographs of the empty interior rooms. The living room where Diane had demanded my eviction was now stripped bare, the walls showing faded rectangles where framed pictures used to hang. The kitchen island where I had set down my glass of ice water before walking out into the night was wiped clean. The physical spaces that had hosted their manipulation were now vacant, sterile assets ready for the market. While my parents sweated through their grueling relocation, the other beneficiary of their theft was facing her own reckoning. Madison's comfortable ecosystem had imploded the moment her luxury funding evaporated. Trevor, her entitled tech entrepreneur fiancé, had tolerated her manufactured anxiety attacks when they were accompanied by fully funded spa days and premium dining experiences. When the cash flow severed, his patience vanished. Trevor demanded that Madison secure employment to contribute to the rent on his leased apartment. Madison responded with her signature tactic, claiming the stress of the job market was triggering debilitating physical symptoms. Without my bank account to subsidize a botanical retreat to smooth over the argument, the conflict escalated. Trevor recognized that his financial anchor was gone. He broke off the engagement, canceled her access to his building, and instructed her to leave. Madison found herself unceremoniously dumped, her shallow lifestyle exposed as a hollow facade built entirely on stolen money. She was currently cycling through the spare couches of distant acquaintances, attempting to spin a new narrative of victimhood to anyone who would listen. Her audience, however, was rapidly shrinking. Richard and Diane were now truly alone. They had sacrificed their housing security, their community reputation, and their only reliable daughter to protect a golden child who abandoned them at the first sign of genuine hardship. They were driving toward a cramped apartment on the edge of the desert where they would spend their twilight years managing their own deficit. They would sit across a cheap laminate dining table with no remaining resources and no one left to blame. The scapegoat had resigned. I scrolled to the final photograph in the inspector's report. It was a close-up image of the front entryway. The heavy brass deadbolt, the same lock I had relinquished a month ago, had been removed. In its place, the inspector had installed a secure digital keypad lock. The door was shut tight. The property was sealed. The visual represented the quiet, definitive click of a closing door on that chapter of my life. I closed the photo viewer and opened my primary email inbox. A message from the title and escrow company awaited my review. The real estate market in Phoenix remained highly competitive, and my holding company had accepted a lucrative all-cash offer on the property less than a week after listing it. The buyer had waived the appraisal contingency, eager to secure a renovated home in a desirable suburban zip code. I downloaded the final closing disclosure. The PDF document detailed the exact financial anatomy of the transaction. I reviewed the columns with the practiced eye of a financial manager. I noted the payoff amount for the original mortgage balance I had carried for 3 years. I verified the prorated property taxes, the title insurance fees, and the broker commissions. Then my eyes moved to the bottom line on the ledger. The document displayed the net cash to seller. The number printed in bold black ink represented the remaining equity in the home. It was a substantial life-altering figure, reflecting the aggressive appreciation of the Arizona housing market and my own careful stewardship of the asset. The profit was remitted directly to the anonymous limited liability company I controlled. I retrieved my digital stylus and applied my electronic signature to the settlement forms. I authorized the title company to execute the final wire transfer. The legal and financial severance was now absolute. I transmitted the signed packet back to the escrow officer. I leaned back in my chair, looking out through the tinted glass at the sprawling desert valley below, ready to collect the return on my investment. 6 months have passed since the digital lock clicked shut on the Phoenix property. It is late January now, a time when the Arizona winter offers a sharp, clear chill in the mornings before yielding to mild golden afternoons. I wake up in a space entirely my own. The morning light spills through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing over wide plank oak floors. There are no heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. There is no frantic knocking on my bedroom door demanding immediate financial triage. There is only a profound restorative silence. I walked away from the closing table with a substantial wire transfer, the crystallized equity of 3 years of silent stewardship. I did not hoard the capital. I rolled the funds directly into a sunlit townhouse in Scottsdale, situated near the foothills of the McDowell Mountains. It is a sanctuary built on a foundation of enforced boundaries. I brew my coffee in a kitchen featuring clean, minimalist lines and unblemished marble counters. No one complains about the scent of the roasted beans. No one asks me to keep my movements restricted to accommodate a fabricated illness. I sit at my quartz island, open my tablet, and review my personal ledger. The numbers grow in a steady upward trajectory, free from the anchor of a family that treated my income as a communal right. The absence of systemic dread has transformed my professional capacity. When you spend your evenings bracing for the next emotional extortion, your cognitive bandwidth is severely restricted. You operate in a perpetual state of defensive survival, mapping out contingencies for crises you did not create. Removing that drain allowed my career to expand rapidly. At the corporate firm downtown, I recently led a risk assessment for a major tech merger. I sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, presenting my financial models to a room of senior partners. They listened with distinct professional respect. They did not interrupt. They did not dismiss my data as the petty concerns of an ungrateful daughter. I delivered the deficit forecasts and the projected yields, guiding the acquisition to a successful close. The managing director offered me a promotion to a senior portfolio director the following week. I accepted the role without hesitation. I no longer decline evening networking events or rush home to prevent a domestic meltdown. I am unburdened, navigating the competitive ecosystem with a clear, sharp focus. My energy belongs exclusively to me and the objectives I choose to pursue. I am respected for my competence, not exploited for my utility. My personal phone rests on the desk, quiet and undisturbed. The family group chats remain dormant. There are no frantic text messages from Diane begging for a bridge loan to cover a sudden, mysterious expense. There are no voicemails from Richard apologizing for his inaction while asking for a small favor. There are no updates regarding Madison and her current housing situation. I established a perimeter 6 months ago, and I have guarded it with lethal consistency. The silence is a testament to the fact that their affection was always conditional. Their love was predicated entirely on my willingness to write the checks and absorb the stress. When the funding ceased, their interest in my existence evaporated. True family does not measure your worth by your utility. They do not calculate your value based on the bills you are willing to pay or the discomfort you are willing to absorb to keep them comfortable. By refusing to fold in that restaurant by pushing the legal documents across the linen tablecloth, I achieved something far greater than recovering stolen capital. I saved my own future. If I had yielded to the societal pressure to maintain the peace, I would have spent the next 3 decades funding their delusions until my own resources ran dry. I would have withered in the shadow of my sister and her manufactured fragility, serving as the invisible infrastructure for a life I was not allowed to enjoy. I chose the friction of eviction over the slow death of compliance. I chose the cold truth of a financial ledger over the warm lie of a toxic family dynamic. The pacing of my life has slowed to a gentle, steady rhythm. The erratic spikes of adrenaline are gone, replaced by the predictable, comforting routine of a life I control. As the late afternoon approaches, I transition away from my corporate monitors. I pour a glass of cold mineral water and walk out onto my private balcony. The Scottsdale landscape stretches out before me, a vast, rugged expanse of red rock formations and resilient desert flora. The sun begins its descent, casting a brilliant spectrum of violet and burnt orange across the horizon. The temperature drops slightly, but the air retains a lingering, pleasant warmth. The heat no longer feels like a weapon. 6 months ago, the blistering summer climate was a threat, a lethal environment my parents used to enforce their demands and punish my boundaries. They believed the harsh elements would break my resolve and force me back under their roof. Now the desert warmth feels like a comfort. It is a reminder of the harsh, beautiful reality of this environment. The desert does not forgive weakness, but it rewards those who adapt, build deep roots, and refuse to be consumed. I stand near the railing, feeling the gentle breeze against my face, watching the shadows lengthen across the canyon. The quiet isolation of the landscape is a mirror of my own internal peace. I built a structure that cannot be breached by unearned entitlement or weaponized guilt. I know there are people listening to this who are currently serving as the silent benefactor for a toxic dynamic. You are balancing the ledgers for parents who offer no gratitude. You are subsidizing siblings who use their manufactured crises to avoid accountability and drain your savings. You are told that keeping the peace is your duty, that setting a boundary is an act of cruelty, and that a reliable child must always sacrifice for the collective good. You are conditioned to believe that you must endure the drain because they share your blood. But blood is merely a biological fact. It is not a binding financial contract. When you recognize that your generosity is being harvested rather than appreciated, you have a moral obligation to protect yourself. You have the right to revoke access to your labor, your peace, and your future. If this story resonates with the silent burden you carry, it is time to audit your own relationships. Identify the individuals who treat your stability as a resource to be mined. Gather your data. Secure your assets. Prepare your exit in silence and execute it with precision. Do not apologize for demanding respect, and do not fund your own destruction. When toxic people cast you out into the heat, let them watch you build an oasis they can never enter.
There is a profound silence that settles over the Arizona desert when the sun finally dips below the jagged horizon. It is a silence that strips away the noise of the day, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of the landscape. In many ways, the story of a reliable daughter cast out into the 115-degree heat by her own parents is not just a tale of financial retribution or legal maneuvering. Beneath the surface of forged deeds, locked accounts, and shattered suburban facades lies a sharp, piercing lesson on the laws of nature and the spiritual ledgers we all keep. When we examine this story through a lens of deep reflection, it transcends a mere family dispute. It becomes a haunting cautionary tale for parents navigating the complexities of modern American culture, a society where individualism, materialism, and the relentless pursuit of status can so easily eclipse the core values of a traditional family structure. To build a true family, one that functions as a sanctuary rather than a transactional contract, we must look inward. We must cultivate a foundation built on 3 unshakable pillars: morality, wisdom, and resilience. The first of these pillars, Morality forces us to confront the stark difference between genuine unconditional love and toxic enabling. In the pursuit of the American dream, there is a pervasive temptation to provide our children with a life devoid of hardship. We want to shield them to give them the comforts we perhaps never had. But when that desire warps into favoritism, when one child is coddled into a state of perpetual fragility, while the other is treated as a bottomless utility, we are no longer nurturing, we are poisoning the well. The greatest moral failing of the parents in this story was not their lack of funds, it was the active theft of their youngest daughter's independence and the ruthless exploitation of their eldest daughter's loyalty. True parental morality requires absolute fairness. It demands the cultivation of character over the preservation of comfort. When affection is twisted into a tolerance for selfish, manipulative, and entitled behavior, it ceases to be love. It becomes a toxic dependency. Children are not instruments to be used for financial gain, nor are they trophies to maintain a flawless suburban facade. Ethical parenting is profoundly selfless. It is about guiding a child towards self-sufficiency without demanding a return on investment, and certainly without sacrificing one child on the altar of another's manufactured needs. This brings us to the second pillar, wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to see through the shimmering mirage of the material world. In our modern consumer society, it is dangerously easy to get swept up in the pursuit of keeping up appearances. We hide our deep-seated insecurities behind the gates of sprawling homes, expensive botanical spa treatments, luxury vacations, and carefully curated social media feeds. But a glossy exterior can never fill a hollow interior. The wisdom of a grounded life recognizes this illusion. True happiness and enduring peace do not reside in the frantic accumulation of resources, especially when those resources are extracted from the very people who trust us. Real peace is found in the freedom of walking through life without owing a debt, neither a financial debt to a bank nor an emotional debt to a child whose grace we have abused. There is an invisible ledger in the universe, an inescapable law of cause and effect. When those parents stood in their air-conditioned kitchen and ordered their daughter out into the lethal, scorching desert night, they did not realize they were casting themselves into the fires of their own karma. Wisdom is understanding that every act of manipulation, every whispered lie, and every stolen dollar leaves an indelible mark. It is the realization that the universe keeps receipts. When we truly comprehend this, we learn to stop to set boundaries on our own greed and to plant seeds of fairness rather than calculating our next extraction. But seeing the truth is only half the battle. Acting on it requires the third pillar, resilience or the courage of the will. It takes an extraordinary, almost painful amount of resilience for a parent to dismantle their own ego and admit they have failed. The parents in this story were paralyzed by their pride. Rather than facing their financial incompetence and their warped parenting, they wore the mask of victims. True resilience is not about using parental authority to bully a child into submission. It is the profound courage to face our own inadequacies, to tear off the masks of manipulation, and to start over from the ground up. Illusory pride only leads to self-destruction. Furthermore, it takes immense emotional fortitude to let our children stand on their own 2 feet. Shielding a child from every storm, indulging every unreasonable demand, and treating every minor discomfort as a crisis only cultivates a generation of fragile, self-centered adults. It requires a formidable strength to step back, to allow our children to face the harsh winds of reality, and to hold them accountable for their own bills, their own choices, and their own mistakes. Raising a capable human being in a traditional family structure means valuing their long-term resilience over their short-term comfort. The family home is not a battleground meant for draining each other dry. It is meant to be a training ground for the soul. It is the crucible where character is forged. When parents take the time to repair their own inner world using wisdom to see through the fleeting nature of material wealth, using morality to offer unconditional fair love, and using resilience to relinquish their need for control, they build an oasis that no desert heat can destroy. They will never find themselves abandoned in the arid wasteland of their own making because they have built a home on solid rock, not shifting sand. If you find yourself reflecting on the invisible ledgers of your own life, examining the boundaries you uphold and the truths you champion, you are not alone in this journey. We explore these profound human dynamics every day, unraveling the quiet strength it takes to face the truth. Take a moment to subscribe and follow our channel Orange Vengeance, where we continue to share stories of quiet courage, moral reckonings, and the beautiful, sometimes painful pursuit of justice. As the dust settles over the canyon and the desert cools under a canopy of unblinking stars, we are left to look at our own reflections in the glass. We must ask ourselves what kind of foundations we are laying for the people who look up to us. Are we building walls to protect them, or cages to keep them tethered to our own fears? The answers rarely come with a loud crash. They usually arrive in the quietest, most unremarkable moments. They arrive when a door clicks shut, when a phone stops ringing, and when we are finally left alone with the echoes of our own choices. Perhaps in the end, the harshest climates we face are not the ones outside our windows, but the ones we cultivate within our own walls. And perhaps the true measure of a life is not what we manage to take from the world, but what remains when everything else is stripped away.